Good evening. I'm going to do a short presentation on Ursula K. Le Guin's story, The One Who Walk Away from Omelas. Here's a couple of pictures of Le Guin, one from a couple of years ago and one from 2013. You can buy the t-shirt, by the way, if you're interested in this. I've never seen it before, but I found it online. Here's a 70-word biographical note. It tells you when she was born and what she's been up to over the last few years. She is a famous writer, mostly of what are people consider science fiction. And as you can see, the awards that she's won, the Hugo, the Nebula, those are awards that are given to science fiction writers. And that's the kind of the genre that she puts herself into. Although the ones who walk away from Omelas, I don't think would count as science fiction. You can see here the publishing history. It was first published in 1973, which was the year I graduated from college, so it's not that old, or maybe to me it is. And you can see it's been published as a standalone book. It's been published in collections of one kind or another. Omelas, the town name, she says, comes from seeing the name Salem, Oregon on a sign and then deciding she would spell it backwards. It begins on the first day of summer. Traditionally, that's June 21st, the summer solstice. And there's a lot in the story that we don't know. We don't know if they have a government, what sort of economy. And she says those are really kind of unimportant questions. She's just focused on the people and how they live and why they are permitted to live the way that they do. The story also does not have a traditional narrative structure. There's no particular characters, although there are human beings who interact with other human beings in the story. But in the traditional way that we think of stories and we think of storytelling, this doesn't fit. She has a different purpose in mind. She says that there was a quotation from the American philosopher and psychologist William James, whose picture's down here in the lower left. And as I mentioned in here, he's the brother to Henry James, whose Real Thing we'll be reading in a couple of weeks. And he wrote this in an essay called The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life in 1891. Or if all the hypotheses were offered us of a world in which Messrs. Fourier, Bellamy, and Morris's utopias should be all outdone and millions kept permanently happy on the one simple condition that a certain lost soul on the far-off edge of things should lead a life of lonely torture, what except a specifical and independent sort of emotion can it be which would make us immediately feel, even though an impulse arose within us to clutch at the happiness so offered, how hideous a thing would be its employment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a bargain. The idea here is the happiness of the many worth the torture of one person? And that's the central idea that lies behind this particular story. But there's more. Okay. Some things to think about, as I mentioned here in this note, is the idea that in this particular case, one person has to sacrifice for everybody else's happiness, and the entire happiness of all the people, the beautiful scenery, the nice people, the happy times that people seem to be having, the fact that nobody seems to go to work, nobody seems to put much effort into much of anything, but they're all happy. However you define happiness, these guys are happy. But it relies very much on the ill treatment of the 6-year-old child who's imprisoned that we see at the end of the story. I want to ask you to think about the idea that maybe there's some parallels to this in your own lives, that maybe we require the labor of a lot of underpaid farm workers or slaughterhouse workers to keep our food supply going. Many of these folks are illegal immigrants, and yet our happiness, our ability to buy a cheeseburger when we want to, relies very heavily on their exploitation. You can think about clothing factories that are almost all overseas now, and we have tons of clothing and it's very inexpensive, but most of it comes from exploited workers in countries far away like Bangladesh or Vietnam. There's some clothing manufactured in China, but that's not where the abuse occurs. It seems to be in these really, truly third world countries. And so every time we shop at H&M or we go to Old Navy, you might want to think about that and say, am I enabling a system here that requires the underpayment, the exploitation of an awful lot of people in order to look good? And that's really the central dilemma that Le Guin's story gives us. Is our happiness dependent on the misery of others? That is the question. And so you have to start thinking about it and say, well, if that's how it works, or that's part of the deal, well, how important is happiness? You know, we all say we want to be happy, but what are we willing to pay for that? And so that's one question, big question for you. Another big question is that, as Le Guin tells us at the end of the story, not everybody stays. People leave. And so one of the things you might want to think about is who leaves, who stays, what motivates the people who leave, and where do they go? She doesn't really tell you that. She says, I don't really know. And you also have to think about, well, where would you be? Would you be someone who leaves or someone who stays? And so she presents us with an extraordinary moral challenge here and forces us to choose. Very much like the lottery, the story relies on the idea of a scapegoat. The child who's imprisoned is kind of the scapegoat, in a sense, for the rest of the community. Whether you agree with that or not, I'd love to see you deal with that in a discussion board post, or maybe even devote your third paper to that idea of just whether or not this particular story fits that particular pattern. It seems clearer to me in the lottery, but maybe less so for this story. Le Guin herself says that both the lottery and this story rely very heavily on the notion of a scapegoat. So I hope you find this interesting. I hope you read the story carefully a couple of times and then start asking yourself these really large questions. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you have to say when we get to the discussion board part. So thank you very much.